I was a youth minister, so I went into the ministry when I was 12, didn't get out until I was 19, and I have sermons where I preached against astrology. The traditional point of view is you are not your chart, whereas more the modern point of view has become you are your chart, and your chart is more about you and your recesses of your psyche. So there are various theories on how interpretation happens.
Yeah.
Some will say it happens in the level of just understanding the symbols. Some will say that it becomes an act of divination, an act of almost divine intervention. I lean more toward that. The skeptic in me didn't die. The skeptic changed. And the skeptic, when I say it's changed, the skeptic is no longer skeptical of astrology, but skeptical of astrologers, including myself. So I think it keeps me honest and questioning and curious.
Good morning for me. Good afternoon for you, Samuel. Welcome to the Light Dump. It's very lovely to have you here. You are an astrologer, educator, writer, and lifelong student of human potential. I love that descriptor. Your path into astrology apparently wasn't incredibly straightforward. You were raised in a powerfully Christian tradition. And you had a skepticism to astrology, and spent many years questioning beliefs, perhaps. It wasn't until from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, a profound 1990 chart that you had done that you thought, I'm going to get stuck into this and have a really good look at it. And I like you for that. That drove you into it. So rather than simply accepting, you got into it and tested astrology yourself and became immersed in it. So here we are, all these years later, and you're known for your thoughtful, practical, and I like this too, dogma-free approach to astrology, viewing it as a system of not a system of fate, but of self-awareness and meaning and conscious choice. So, yeah, initially you had doubts, Samuel, and resistance perhaps around astrology. So what drew you to it?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Susie.
My pleasure.
Second, I think that was a brilliant, succinct introduction. One of my favorites so far. You have definitely studied your subject. I appreciate that. And you're very direct. I almost want to ask you your astrology. I'm like, you went right in terms of that. So I appreciate that as well. So what informed my skepticism? I can pinpoint at least three things. One you touched on. So some measure of it was from my religious past. Then some of it is from my academic past, which is where I engaged astrology seriously. And some measure of that was mixed in with the third thing, which is my personal past. And so you might, well, what do you mean by personal? Let me go over each one of them. Religious is probably for anyone who's come from a religious background, especially fundamentalist evangelical, is probably easily understood. Well, astrology is something that one that interprets the Bible a certain way as being explicitly against astrology. And I was a youth minister, so I went into the ministry when I was 12, didn't get out until I was 19, and I have sermons where I preached against astrology. So that was one thing that informed it. At 19 and then onward, I became an academic and I was pursuing my master's and PhD in African American studies. So after I had come out of religion, as one does, I went into atheism. You kind of have a swing reaction. And so I became more convinced that the only things that were real were race, gender, and class. And, more the postmodernist Marxist sensibility and prism. And so when I encountered astrology, it was through that prism. And what was the personal is that I'm born on the putative cusp between Scorpio and Sagittarius, 11/22, 1967. And so what ties in with the religious and then even the academic was some measure of confusion, to be honest. Am I a Scorpio or Sagittarius?
Mm.
And at the time, in 1990, I was courting the attention of an older woman. Isn't that always the case? No, not always, but um, I was courting the attention of an older Gemini woman who, who was kind and wise enough not to be dismissive of me. So she befriended me, but she didn't indulge me, right? She's like, boy, get serious. No. I mean, I think there was a 20-year gap between us.
Right.
Um, so she's like, yeah, nah. Um, but she was into astrology and she was convinced, because I was, the choice between the arachnid, Scorpio, and the centaur, I felt clearly I was the centaur. And she's like, no, I think you're the bug. And I was like, oh, no, no, I'm not a Scorpion, blah, blah, blah. So when I did come to encounter an astrologer by accident, and I can go into that in a second, when I encountered an astrologer, I thought this would be an opportunity to shut the Gemini up and once and for all know that I was a centaur, only to discover I was the bug. I was the Scorpion. But he told me a little more than just my sun sign. He actually said something related to a dynamic between my parents and my brother in utero that I had only learned 2 months before.
Oh.
Um, and so I was like, "How do you know that?" Because during the consultation, I kind of was stone faced because I thought he was just another reader, and he didn't really say anything initially, Susie, that grabbed me as out of the blue. Like I told him I
Mm.
was a graduate student, and he said something like, "Well, you seem like a pretty smart fella." And I didn't say anything to that because what are you going to say? Like, yeah, I am. But I was like, yeah, okay. I mean, I told you I was in graduate school. Chances are I'm not an idiot. I didn't say that out loud, but I'm
But
thinking like,
that's your
okay,
thinking, yeah.
right. I'm like, okay, is this just, cold reading? Like, what is this? But when he started talking about the in utero dynamics, I'm like, how do you know that? He's like, oh, it's right here. And he got all avuncular about it. Like, I'm looking at your Mercury. And I'm like, none of that made sense to me. And I was like,
Mm.
it set me thinking that there was some kind of trick to this because I had done some work in prestidigitation as a kid related to magic, stage magic. So I was like, this must be some mentalist, you know, magic trick. And so that is what set me flowing. And I actually, being a researcher myself in academia, I felt the only way to legitimately approach this was to study it myself, not rely on secondary or tertiary sources.
Mhm.
Because one of the things I'll say about being in African American studies, considering that a lot of the studies related to Black people in America was dotted with some aspects of racism, you come to rely more on primary sources than
Right.
thinking about secondary and tertiary sources. So that was my natural inclination to go more toward primary sources. So I borrowed books, and strange things started happening. And I'll mention this because this is important. I was talking to someone in my graduate housing about my experience with this astrologer for some reason. I still don't, to this day, don't remember why. But I was talking to her about my experience, and she said, I'm into astrology. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, maybe I can borrow books from you to kind of understand more
Mm.
like what this is about or how this worked. And on a lark, I asked her, well, when's your birthday? November 22nd? November 22nd, when? November 22nd, 1967. We were born the same exact year
Oh,
and day. And I was
oh.
like, that's weird.
Mm.
Um, that goes beyond the pale of just chance. Because even though I had embraced a certain level of atheism, I still had respect for the mysterious, the
Yeah.
numinous, right? And I felt like that's a weird thing to happen. That I'm talking to
Mm.
this woman who I didn't know well. We have the same birthday. She's into astrology. And the dynamic between us even got a little more complicated without going too much into it, in the sense that eventually what happened is that she became an evangelical Christian
Oh my
and
gosh.
I became an astrologer.
You swapped.
So, yeah, and she renounced astrology, and I became more of an astrologer. So, I spent the next 10 years studying charts, always with the eye on it all falling apart, till I realized it wasn't going to fall apart. So, that's that's the capstone to the story.
When did you realize it wasn't going to fall apart?
So that would have been 2000, the year 2000, 10 years later. And it was funny how it happened. I had moved to New York. I was living in Philadelphia because I was in school in Philadelphia and stayed there after school. After I left my PhD program, I didn't complete my PhD. I just stayed. I went into theater, went a completely different direction.
Oh.
And which ties in more of my mimesis, and some of that has been influential in my work as an astrologer. But I was at a party, a Christmas party, and I was debating another skeptic. And I could anticipate some measure of his questions because I had some of the same questions. And he asked me point blank, he said, "But you don't really believe it, do you?" And this was the moment where something congealed, and I was like, "Yeah, I guess I do." And I said exactly that. I said, "I believe I do." And that was kind of more so when it became clear to me, like, oh, I have gone beyond the pale of just being this skeptic to someone who's an active participant. I don't know if I would use the right word to say that one comes to believe in astrology, that one comes to see its validity. It's not like a
Mm.
religion.
Yeah, yes. So, on reflection of that time, what do you think astrology was actually inviting you into?
Hmm. Well, it invited me into more broader contemplation of the cosmos. Um, I came to develop a different relationship to what we could call the divine or the numinous.
Hmm.
Um, Less as being preoccupied with it as a being, but as a way of encountering all the things that we don't know. Um, and I went through stages in my quote unquote non-belief or absence of belief because how I embraced astrology still was academic adjacent for a time. I
Hmm.
saw it as an interesting hermeneutic, a way of asking questions. And that became my guiding principle for probably a good large portion of those 10 years. But over the last, I mean, this is 2000, over the next several decade, it became more an encounter with the numinous rather than just thinking that it was just a hermeneutic. And it is a hermeneutic, but it's a hermeneutic truly related to Hermes, where you are being transported between worlds. And it's being able to encounter the numinous divine world that goes beyond the pale of human consciousness or the human understanding, or knowledge. And this is more where I've landed. So it does transport us to some level of what we can talk about as the magical, the enchanted might be the other way we could talk about it, or the
Yeah,
divinatory.
yeah.
And so um, I think what astrology was trying to pull me toward, well, one, service,
Mm.
and then two, because I still stayed in the ministry of sorts, didn't I? Um, and then I think two was broadening my mind to entertain more beyond just race, gender, and class, more the physical, socioeconomic circumstances. Now, there's a way in which there's been a happy marriage related to that because I do think astrology is an artifact of culture. And by virtue of it being um, an artifact from multiple tributaries of culture, I
Mm.
think it has a dynamism that is infused with a lot of different things, but that doesn't diminish. its impact related to the spirit, or what we can call the spiritual.
I find this so interesting because we were having a little discussion just before we came on, and I'm pretty much probably like a lot of people out there. Many years ago, had my chart done, found it kind of interesting, put it in the bottom drawer. There it sits, right? And I never really delved. And in my own, I guess you would call spiritual evolvement, remembering whatever. In the last year or so, I've become very conscious that we are, we, not me, we, this we-ness, and our perception of the planet, Earth, that we are on, is very much in a bigger cosmos situation that we
Sure.
interact with. That I've known about, but I've felt it more. And I do suspect, I don't want to say I know this because I don't, but I suspect that consciousness is coming on board with a lot of people. And astrology meets that to a degree and starts to make one consider the bigger impact of our cosmos on us, with us. Okay, so this is where I thought I need to get astrologer here. That's why I've got you here. And and I think I'm very curious as to what makes this ancient systems too, because as you just touched on a little, there are different versions of astrology out there. And what makes it endure? And what might it tell us about ourselves as the collective consciousness and what we're living through right now?
I think it reflects it. At the same time, it it reflects it and transcends it. It's kind of like when you can look at yourself in a pond. Let's say you're outdoors,
Mm.
and you can reflect and see yourself, and then in the same moment you can see that's all around you, right? The trees, and maybe a deer that's just come over your shoulder that's come to drink, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's a way in which you can become aware of something beyond yourself, as above, so below, as within, so without, as the cosmos, so the soul. And it becomes this interplay and dynamic. Because one of the fascinating things about astrology as versus other forms of divination, which is not to negate any other form of divination, but one thing I think makes it unique, you're dealing with the bigness of the sky.
Mhm.
And so, in dealing with the bigness of the sky, seeing the sun, the moon, and since it was developed largely in the northern hemisphere, and now it's also in the south, there's ways in which we encounter the sky that will have some similitude. Now, of course, the southern sky is different from the northern sky,
Mm.
as
Yeah.
you well
Mm.
know. Even the
Mm.
position, how the moon appears, is different in the southern sky
Mm.
um, than how it looks in the northern sky. But at the time, as astrology was going through its initial evolution, we could look at it and see patterns, not just in terms of constellations, but even movements of planets, of what came to be known as planets and stars, that seemed to have a bigger picture rather than just looking at the entrails of birds, or now, in tarot, um, or just looking out your window and just looking at your own
Gazing.
segment of the
Yeah.
sky.
Mm.
So there's a bigness to astrology that makes it endure. And to your point, since you talked about a collective consciousness or unconscious or however you want to frame it, it's different from religion, especially as someone who's been immersed in two religions, Abrahamic religions, because I eventually even converted to Islam, and that became a different thing, but that's a topic for another moment. But What's different about astrology and its durability is that it can speak to one's specific circumstances, whereas religion often speaks to broader circumstances of believers, but not
Yeah.
necessarily related to you, unless you, by virtue of your own experience, have an encounter with the divine. Well, Jesus came to me and we had tea and said to me, blah, blah, blah. I can't debate that. I would never debate that because that's your experience, but
Mm.
that's very different than someone looking at a chart and then speaking with you and saying, like, oh, you have trouble or problems with your father. How do you know that? Right? That becomes a way in which you then are in a conversation or interlocution of an understanding that goes beyond yourself, because now someone else is saying something intimate about your life where they would have no way of knowing, just like my encounter with the astrologer,
Mm.
in terms
Mm.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
um talking about in utero things that happen, which go went beyond the pale of guesswork.
Yeah.
So I think there's a specificity that comes through with astrology related to a specific segment of the sky that
Hmm.
speaks to or can speak to you through the astrologer or one who studies astrology, your experience of yourself.
So I've got a couple of questions here. So I'm going to jump to this one on that. Does astrology describe reality, help us interpret reality, or participate in reality? Or when reality is a debatable thing anyway. So, yeah.
I don't think astrology has, or astrologers have, a uniform answer on that, which is where it opens it up to suspicion, both from the church or religions, and opens it up to suspicion from other skeptics or forms of skepticism. Because astrologers, in one breath, especially more modern or contemporary astrologers, will talk about as descriptive power. And then some astrologers, maybe we could say that this is more traditional or even Eastern in terms of Vedic astrology. It becomes prescriptive, like it's telling you what will happen or
Right.
must happen in your life.
Right.
And then in terms of participatory, I think all of them, all the different tributaries will talk about it, but with different levels of participatory power. So, for instance, I have kind of succinctly put it as fate has two arms, one of them is your own. And so that's more descriptive
Mm.
of how you are, yes, a participant, but it's still kind of set by something that's put you in motion.
Yes.
But it does put in the question, especially in the more modern sense, was that fate or the aspect of free will? And then this gets into more one's sense of belief. And
Mm. Mm.
for those of us who've come from the Abrahamic tradition, we may talk more about free will because that's something that has been inculcated into us, um, that we have free will, whatever that might mean. But for those from other traditions and even more traditional, we'll say it's more fate, but because you don't know the elements all the elements of your fate, what you might talk about as free will really are just the things you don't really have an understanding of the deeper recesses of all the different pieces of fatum or fate that are nestled in you. So it becomes a matter of perception. I tend to, like I said, when I talk about fate having two arms, I will be more descriptive because I find that when you talk about proscription, it brings up two possible fallacies. One possible fallacy is that you know all the dimensions of fatum or pieces of fate in someone's life. The other thing that we could talk about is that the astrologer may attribute things to free will, where it really just could be the short sightedness or lack of sight of the astrologer.
Mm.
And that is something that I think many astrologers are reluctant to embrace because they may say, like, well, I predicted that this will happen to you. And if it doesn't happen, well, that counts to free will.
Free will.
And
Yeah.
I'm like,
It's an out
that also could
clause.
be a cop out.
Yeah. Yeah.
That could be a cop out. It's kind of like, no, no, you just got it wrong. Period.
Yeah.
Full stop. But we don't fully know, and that's kind of the thing that makes astrology so interesting and intriguing, at least to me or for me.
It's so interesting. I mean, I was writing questions down here and I said, if someone were to ask you simply, what is astrology? Is it a science? Is it a philosophy? Is it a symbolic language or a language, a cosmology, a practice, a map, or something else entirely, or all of the above?
We
Yeah.
could say mostly all of the above. The one thing I
Yeah.
would say it's not, and there's a reason why I say it, and I'll be very specific in my reasoning. I do not think it's a science. And the reason why I don't think it's a science is not because it's not a science in a traditional sense. Now, in the traditional sense, scientia meant knowledge and only just knowledge.
Hmm.
But in the modern sense, science tends to have certain conditions, which
Yes.
means that it can deal with replicable results, either that we can have under specific conditions. And on that level, because it has such symbolic, nuanced value, it isn't strictly replicable in the sense that many scientists require. Which again is not to say in the ancient sense of scientia or science that it's not, but in the modern sense,
Yeah.
it doesn't meet
Yeah.
that prerequisite. But I do think if someone were to ask me, I would say it's a discipline of study of how we can think about the heavens in relation or in relationship with the earth and vice versa.
And those
So that
sounds.
that does
Mm.
go with some measure of symbolic value. And sometimes it has a certain aspect of literalism, you know, weird literalism, like um, an eclipse kind of can signify where someone eclipses other things or comes to have more prominence
Mm.
in a certain way,
Mm.
or eclipses a certain aspect of their personality, or even aspects of their life, right? So it can have this symbolic value that oftentimes does come with some literal reference, but not always. And
And
that's the hard part to predict.
there's definitely I sense a strong curiosity of many people, whether they're into astrology or not. When there's a blue moon that we've just recently had, just in the last few days, as you say, an eclipse, I think even our telco here um, acknowledges that when Mercury is retrograde, that things might be going a bit skew with your internet, and things communication becomes tricky. There's those sorts of little snippets out there in the every ordinary day ether that are kind of accepted, actually, completely accepted.
Yeah, I mean, astrology is so infused in Western culture. This is when I encounter skeptics who seem to emphasize empiricism. What is how do you prove things, or they only want to relate to things that are provable. And that is not how human life has constructed itself. I will say to them like, "Oh, okay, what day is it?" They're like, "What? What day is it?" "It's Monday." "Okay, it's Monday." "I agree, it's Monday." "Why do we call it that?" "Moon day." And it's more so related to a cultural reference that we've organized time a certain way. And by virtue of organizing it a certain way, and this is why I say it's, astrology is a cultural artifact as well. By organizing it, we come to experience things a certain way. You and I agreed on a certain time we would meet on a certain day to meet, even thousands of miles away from each other. For our forebears, our ancient forebears, it would be a miracle because it's
Absolutely.
like, how did you coordinate that in the sense of time? For us, it's just happenstance and very simple, but it's basically how we can understand time. Astrology works in the same sensibility. The Egyptians once had a week that was 10 days long. Now we have 7 days, which is
Mm,
right. There's no empirical notion of what makes one wrong or one right. It's just a matter of how we've conveniently set up time. And by virtue of that, we can have an experience that is not just derived by empiricism,
mm,
which is kind of the impulse of science. It's like, well, just show me and put it in the lab. I'm like, even if you could put it in a lab, that wouldn't be your experience of it,
mm,
And I say to skeptics all the time, you could tell me that love and relationships boils down to pheromones and hormones and
mhm,
releases of oxytocin, but I dare you to say that to your partner. I dare you to say, if they ask you, do you love me? You won't say I've acquired a predilection for your being because there's an oxytocin release that predisposes me to like you. You're not going to say that. You're going to say, well, yeah, of course I love you. But that's the experience of it.
yes,
It's not just
yes.
the empiricism.
We're such a mishmash of that, aren't we? And we
We are.
flip-flop between. We flip-flop between it.
Well,
Interesting.
in the modern sense, which has been interesting, because unlike our forebears, I think there was really an embrace of the intersubjectivity, going back to your original question,
Mm,
of
mm,
our encounter with a cosmos, with something larger than ourselves. But in the last 400 or 500 years, in the development of what we call Western culture, there's been this impulse toward wanting to achieve a certain tertiary position, which is quote unquote objective. Um, and rather than intersubjective, we believe that we can achieve a distance from it, that everything is just an object um, out there from us rather than something to encounter as us. And that's kind of where I would say the big difference between astrology and astronomy is. Astrology looks at every object in the sky as mirroring the psyche, whereas astronomy is like, that's just an object in the sky.
yeah, yeah, yeah. This strange disconnect, duality. Yeah, it's interesting. I want to talk to you a bit about, we touched on it before again, Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. I'm in the Southern, and and we're coming up to the Lion's Gate, which is on the 8th of the 8th. And that portal stays open for a period of time, but the pinnacle is the 8th of the 8th. And it's said to close on the 12th. I was born on the 13th of the 8th, and yet I was born on the 13th in the southern hemisphere of the 8th, which is still the 12th in the northern hemisphere. So am I still in that? And it's really
Well,
interesting, you know.
the Lion's Gate is not universally accepted, just so you know, in the astrological world.
I'm a
It is
Leo, so
something.
I accept it.
Okay, you accept that, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, but in terms of the Lion's Gate as a thing,
Yeah.
it's debated. But what's interesting in the last 10, 20 years, there has emerged a debate about whether there's a difference by virtue of signatures for a Leo in the southern hemisphere as versus a Leo in the northern hemisphere,
Hmm.
because there is um a distinction in terms of one's experience. Like it's winter for you and it's summer in the northern hemisphere.
Correct.
And there are some astrologers, and I'm among them in that camp, who think it's the same. Leo is Leo. But there's a growing number of astrologers, largely from the southern hemispheres, like there may be a difference. Um, I tend to think it's the same because, and this is going back to something I said earlier, I think astrology is also a cultural artifact. And because it's been developed largely in a northern Western context, and
Mm,
that's been transported like our language, you and I
mm,
both can understand each other
sure,
by virtue of English, even though we have different accents,
sure.
all these other things. I think the astrology stays the same, even though it has a different seasonal reference. Because I don't think astrology is purely seasonal, which, and some people who know some astrology go like, well, that's the difference between the sidereal zodiac and the tropical zodiac. And I don't think that is accurate. I don't think it's accurate because the tropical zodiac, even though some tropical astrologers will decide it or describe it this way, is not purely seasonal. Um, it is tropical, meaning that there are turning points related to where it is on Earth, the Tropic of Cancer versus the Tropic of Capricorn, and then at the equator. But those turning points aren't just related to particular seasons. You're like, well, how is it not? Just think of places like India or parts of India or parts of Africa that might be in the northern hemisphere that don't have winters the same way. They don't have a fall, they may have a
Mm,
monsoon. And
mm,
so it's not just a matter of, and even in the places in the tropics, there are parts of it that don't have all four seasons in the same way that we may have
that's
four
right.
seasons.
Yeah.
But there are turning points related to different parts of the year. So that's the, and tropos in Latin and Greek does mean turn. Um, so that's kind of the understanding, tropic.
Hmm.
So why I'm mentioning this is that it's not just purely seasonal. So it's not because you experience winter in August that this becomes like, oh, then that should make you more like Aquarius than Leo. But that there are those who are like, well, maybe there's some other kind of way in which we can understand it. I haven't tuned in as much to that debate as recently because I made up my mind for it. But you
Sure.
know, um,
Sure.
I probably should just because I like to understand different points of
Sure.
view.
Yeah.
But I do want to make, you and your audience aware that this is not the only particular perspective. Um, in terms of the Lion's Gate is interesting, and I won't get too deep into it because the Lion's Gate comes out of a very specific context of eclipses that happened pretty much 20 years ago or more along the Leo Aquarius axis. And it was one particular astrologer who felt it would open up a particular portal of energy at that specific time. And then it's just caught on and carried on for the last 20 years, even though that wasn't the initial intention.
It wasn't to do with the Egyptian, I mean, the alignment of
Uh-uh.
Syria. No, no.
No, that's what it's become. And that's what he tied it to at the
Right.
time. But the problem with that is the heliacal rising of Sirius is which is what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
It depends on the latitude where you are. So it's not just for a specific date, like, from 8/8 to the 12th. It could be from sometime in July into sometime in later August, because there's different lines of latitude for that star to rise above the horizon. And in some places, it may not rise. So it's not
Yeah.
universal.
I did understand that. I think it was end of July through to 12th. Yeah, that's yeah, through to the 12th.
Yeah, it's a
But
little more. But
yeah,
you're still Leo in the Western conventional sense.
yeah. I want to go back into this and talk to you about archetypes because I'm very interested in this and I've been thinking about it. Plato spoke of his ideal forms. There was Jung later who looked at reoccurring patterns and myths in human behavior. And astrology works symbolically within archetypes as well. Um, Are astrology and archetypes describing the same underlying structures of consciousness?
So Jung's notion of archetypes is very different from Plato's.
Mm.
Um, so Plato's notion of archetypes was dealing with the primary creation of things. Like there's an archetypal horse. There's a archetypal way in which one experiences division. When I say division, I don't mean math. I mean like separation.
Sure.
And so there's different permutations of how one experiences it from the archetype. Whereas Jung felt that there were more collective, communal um, aspects of being, like archetypal mother, archetypal father, that relate to it. Now, that is something that has become popular through the contemporary lens of astrology.
Hmm.
But that is not necessarily something that is from the traditional. And when I say traditional, there is a bifurcation or multiple way you could slice the pie of between what we might talk about astrology before Enlightenment, say the 18th, 17th centuries,
Hmm.
and then subsequently in terms of astrology since Enlightenment. And the the difference may be that one, there was more reliance on traditional sources from Plato to Plotinus to Iamblichus to ways of understanding how we experience Saturn as a sense of principle, whereas from Enlightenment it was more trying to tie it to the human psyche and experience of the psyche, more
Ah, okay.
anthropological, more psychological. So it became more contained in the way that we can understand consciousness and unconsciousness. Whereas the more traditional way was dealing with other elements of consciousness itself between planets and other beings, whether we're talking about daimons, fae, any other assortment
Sure,
of beings.
sure, sure.
And so everything was not contained or related to the human psyche in that world. So when we talk about archetypes, we are mostly talking about it through the modern lens of the Jungian lens, which has its good elements and its challenging elements, in my opinion.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
this goes back to even one of your initial questions in terms of how we perceive astrology as descriptive. You didn't mention this word, but prescriptive or
Hmm.
interpretive. Um, so, in terms of the modern sensibility of archetypes, we tend to talk about different manifestations of Venus as related to the archetype of Aphrodite, of Venus, of um, Ishtar, or we could say also Oshun from the Yoruba
Yeah,
African tradition,
yeah, yeah.
and as principles related to love. Now, many astrologers who are more of the traditional lore have a bone to pick with that. And
Right.
the bone that they pick is like, well, what you've done is amalgamate from a very modern point of view very different gods um, under one umbrella, almost as if they're all of one type, not recognizing that they are not necessarily, especially for someone who worships them.
So it's become
So,
reductive in a way.
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a reductionism
Mm.
um, that can happen related to the archetypal sense of the universe. And on some level, one can argue it's kind of atheistic, which makes sense
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
um, Jungian and, by extension, even though we know they're not the same, um, psychoanalysis, Freudian, which
Mm,
had initial influence on Jung,
mm,
um, we're attempting to frame a cosmos separate from God's
yeah.
to some degree. And so when we talk about the archetypal universe, or, astrologers talk about archetypes a certain way, there is a certain unease that happens for the more traditional astrologer because it's like, well, especially if it's like, let's say they're Vedic,
Hmm.
when I say Lakshmi, I mean literally Lakshmi. I'm not
Hmm.
talking about the principle of wealth or the archetype of the goddesses of wealth.
You're talking about her. Yeah.
Talking about
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets into a dicey territory, which, if I were a skeptic, I always say this to my students. If I ever went back to that world, lost my mind and went to the dark side, I say, and there are various bones I could pick with astrologers, because it's like, well, you guys kind of both, you guys speak out of both sides of your mouth on some level. That's one of the things I might pick at. I'm like, okay, so when you're talking about Venus, who are you really talking about? Because if we're talking about Aphrodite, she has a whole different mythic arc to some degree than Venus, even though, yes, they're informed by each other. So, which is it really? Same thing for Zeus. What with Zeus Pater? Zeus
Mm,
Pater is what becomes Jupiter. Father Zeus.
mm.
Um, so it becomes a way in which we've collapsed things and things kind of get meshed, and even more so when we start thinking about the difference between Zeus Pater and, say, I'm trying to remember the Babylonian name for that god, but there's even like a thunder god from the
Hmm.
Babylonian lore,
Hmm. Hmm.
Marduk, I believe. Marduk is the name. So it's this is why I say there's all these different tributaries,
Yeah.
and there's a way in which, you know we we don't, pluck out the different nuances and differences anymore. But when we kind of return to the idea of archetype, there's a lot of collapsing.
Yeah. This is so interesting though, because it takes me back to that me and we thing. It was a lot more we initially, and then it became me. So it's going within and making it very much a reflection, if you like, of just what is around us, the human reflection self, rather than that bigger metaphoric reflection that was from way back when. And
Hmm.
now, so is it evolving?
I think so. Well, yeah, I know it is. And what's interesting, I think there's a dialogue to your point. So, for instance, and you're very, you know, perceptive, since you've only been immersed in this for a year, in that sense, to glean that there is this distinction that has happened, because the
Yeah.
traditional point of view is you are not your chart. Whereas more the modern point of view has become you are your chart, and your chart is more about you and the,
Hmm.
your recesses of your psyche.
Mm.
And when I say, and I'm not just promulgating the traditional point of view as like this is the correct point of view. I'm not that. I'm a
No,
hybrid.
no. Yeah.
Um, but one of the things that was part of the traditional point of view is that you are participatory in something larger. And so when you related to Saturn, it wasn't just like archetype of Saturn. It was the spirit of Saturn, because that related to, whether you wanted to do election or you wanted to create a
Mm.
talisman to infuse the spirit of Saturn or the spirit of a star into an inanimate object to where, or have some measure of remediation. So there was
Mm.
more of this. dialogue that happened that wasn't just about you. But as we entered more of the world of the psyche and the quote unquote unconscious, it became a lot more self contained. And in fact, one thing that's interesting in the pedagogy of astrology, one didn't get to the point of studying your natal chart until you had studied something called Hore, which is kind of being able to divine for a question, or, like, where's my watch or something, or
Hmm.
will my ship come in? To mundane astrology, and then natal was kind of more being able to tie it on together to relate it to a person. So natal was one of the last things you studied, but now it's the reverse.
Yeah.
It's the first thing you study, and you also may get into it from your sun sign, which is kind of where I started. Am I a Scorpio or a Sagittarius? And then you
Mm.
come to realize, like, well, it's not even just about your sun sign. I mentioned you have a moon, you have your Mars and Venus in Cancer, you have a rising sign and the planet that's in charge of that. And that gives you a sense of understanding in your larger picture in the world, but also other people in your life, descriptive of your siblings, descriptive of your parents, um, your life trajectory, all these different things that become part of understanding your chart as a way of understanding not just yourself, but the world around you.
So that's how, going back to your initial chart that really blew you away, that particular astrologer was able to see something in your gestation period as you were coming into into who you are now, that that was
Mhm.
that was in your chart.
Well, here's something funny, Susie. What I've come to believe. So there are various theories on how interpretation happens.
Yeah.
Some will say it happens in the level of just understanding the symbols. Some will say that it becomes an act of divination, an act of almost divine intervention.
Right. Channeling,
I skew
if you
almost to
like.
some degree, but
Yeah.
it's akin to that. But I would say it's more so something, yes, working through you. We could say your
Yeah.
daimon, your spirit, or whatever.
Mm.
I lean more toward that because I feel what that astrologer said, if my trajectory, my soul trajectory, whatever you want to talk about from a divine point of view, or just kind of a cultural point of view, or just a
Mm.
mandate, like if something or someone wanted me to become an astrologer, I think something broke through him because it was as if something said, like, we're not going to get to this boy unless we hit him with something that seems improbable. And that was that for me. Like if he had said, and he had started saying, some other things like, oh, it looks like you're a pretty smart guy. And, you know, it looks like you may have had some problems in your development in utero.
Hmm.
Um, and you can't see me, but I'm short for a man. I'm 4'11". So
Hmm.
he could see me because it was in person. So when he said that, I was like, that's not a hard guess, dude. I mean, like,
Mm.
statistically, right?
Mm.
Being 4'11", something happened. So I don't think that, whether that's genetic. So I
Mm.
was like, that didn't blow me away. What blew me away is that he mentioned specifically, looks like something was happening between your mom, and your father, and perhaps a sibling, maybe a brother, that happened in utero that complicated your pregnancy. He literally said that.
Wow.
And I was like, that's when I was like, how do you know that? Because that's what happened. My brother saw something that he wasn't meant to see and
Hmm.
shared it with my mother, which created the complication.
And she brought that through to you. Yeah.
Correct. So I was like, that was
I totally believe that. I
so
totally believe
I
that.
think
Yeah.
it was a matter of divine
Yeah.
intervention. Because I think, yeah, and through another set of readings that weren't astrological, it was more from the Yoruba tradition, an African tradition. This diviner said to me, and on this trajectory in my mind to become an academic. And he said, "You are meant to be a diviner." And I remember thinking when he said that, I was like, "Oh, that's not going to happen. That's crazy." Okay, sure. But he was totally correct.
Here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Which
Wow.
speaks to something that,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what broke me out of atheism, slowly, gingerly. That something else is at work. Whether you want to call that the divine, the divine, the collective unconscious, the unconscious, whatever you want to, the superconscious, whatever you want to call it, there's something at work. I've come to believe, because I'm definitely someone who still has a kinship to science, um, and hard facts to some degree.
Okay. Yeah.
And I read a lot of different things from neuroscientists. And one of the things neuroscientists are talking about more and more now, um, is they don't know where consciousness comes from. They do not believe
That's right.
it
Yeah.
originates in the brain. They don't know where it comes from. And so there is something that comes at work. Now, of course, they're not going to call it God. And I wouldn't either, actually. I don't know what that, but consciousness is something that goes beyond, I think, um, our understanding.
In the brain, in the parameters that we've put
Correct.
into this
This meat
meaty
suit.
meat suit, yeah, that we have. It's very interesting, but it's interesting that we're even talking about it and delving into it and exploring it. And that brings me back a little bit back to astrology, which is my awareness of needing to be more aware of what it has to offer to do with our evolution of consciousness being raised.
Yes, but I think it's slower than we are prepared to say.
Oh, I don't
This
want to
is
hear
where I do
that.
differ from this is where I do differ from more the norm. I
Mm,
hear what you're saying, because this is where, one thing I'll say to you, this may be helpful because you felt drawn to me because of my background. The skeptic in me didn't die. The
yeah,
skeptic changed.
yeah.
And the skeptic, when I say it's changed, I'll be very direct. The skeptic is no longer skeptical of astrology, but skeptical of astrologers, including myself. So I think it keeps me honest and
Mm,
questioning and curious.
mm.
Um, so if I had, like I said, went to the dark side, if I fell off my wagon right now, right?
Yeah.
And astrologers, I listen occasionally to astrologers, just kind of, when I say occasionally, I don't mean like, I have colleagues I listen to. I just came back from a conference.
Yeah.
So I listen to my colleagues, of
Sure.
course. But I
Sure.
mean, when I just randomly, go on social media and I listen to astrologers, one of the things I often hear is like, "Oh, this full moon is going to be like a change related to our consciousness," and
Okay.
and when we say this is going to heighten our consciousness, the skeptic kind of pops out of me and looks around and saying like, "It looks, I don't know, it looks like we're the same mofo's we've always been, actually." Um, what
Hmm.
changes are we talking about?
Hmm.
Really in this in total. I don't like to say masses, um, but across the board.
Hmm.
Like, and my compromise would be, I think we there are definitely some measurable differences, but I don't think they're at the scale we might like to have them.
Right.
One of the things that Steven Pinker, who's a linguist and an atheist, and a philosopher, he wrote a book, um, Better Angels of Our Nature, I believe is the name of it. And he argues something that I have come to believe, even though some differ. Um, we are doing better in how we encounter evil. And I don't mean like the personification of evil as the devil, but more so an awareness in how we deal with violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we could make the argument like, oh, we're still the same violent creatures we've always had been. On some level, some of that is true. But on
Mm.
another level, we're far more willing to engage and be involved in aspects of violence or try to disarm aspects of violence.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking
Yeah.
about what's happening in Israel, Palestine,
Yeah.
or Ukraine, or any other place, I think we care a lot more.
Mm.
I think the last, even, do we still have racism? Yes, but I think there is an awareness that it is a fault against humanity, or humanism, which wasn't true necessarily 200 or 300 years ago.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
do think there is a difference. Um, I always like to remind people there's never been a generation of women worldwide as there is right now, collectively, that is as educated, has as much financial resources,
Mm.
political resources, as and being as involved and as educated worldwide. I mean,
And
of
having
course,
a
there have always been
voice.
pockets, huh?
Having a voice.
And having a voice. And
Yeah.
I think that is a statement of human evolution.
Yeah.
Um, so, and a human evolution that has created a crisis for men. I
Yeah.
think worldwide. And I think that, so there are moments where we are seeing shifts in consciousness,
Mm.
but not always at the scale that astrologers and others like to describe. Like, I think it comes from, it's painful. It comes from a lot of
Yeah.
political engagement,
Yeah.
economic engagement, social engagement, so that's my take.
If in an ideal world we were able to teach astrology in school, would we be in a different place?
Yes,
Mm.
I think we would. What's interesting, Montessori schools or theosophy, schools
Hmm.
influenced by theosophy,
Mm.
there is some influence of astrology. Now, in Montessori schools, it comes through temperament. Um, I don't know if it's Montessori. Oh, it's the other kind of schools, not Montessori. Waldorf schools.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In Waldorf
Okay.
schools, there's some measure of influence through temperament. And it's acknowledging that a child's uniqueness is where one needs space in order to grow. Um, and, more their sense of understanding. And I think going back to something I said, this is what astrology can do that religion can't. Because religion would talk about what is your mandate from a collective point of view, in
Yeah.
terms of being a Christian, being a Jew,
Yeah.
being a Muslim. Whereas astrology can talk about your specific mandate, um, related to what becomes like I looked at your chart and you would have needed space to be able to go deep into something, to have your rabbit holes. We have a
Yeah.
Mercury Pluto conjunction.
Mm.
So the need to be able to research, think deeply about things, um, that's where you would need more space is versus like, well, think quick and
Right.
answer the quiz and all these other things, you would want to have more space to ponder. Um, so if we could acknowledge the distinctions in our mandates and allowing children, for instance, to be able to explore things more on their own terms based on their understanding beyond just sun sign astrology, which is what most skeptics think astrology is, I think people would be a lot happier. But we're just doing the opposite. I don't know how it
Yeah.
is in New Zealand, but here in my country, in the States, we have succumbed more to a cookie cutter, broad scale testing set of curricula that almost completely ignore the mandates of any individual.
Mm.
And so many children are
Mm.
either left behind or propelled at ridiculous speeds that neglect some of their unique needs. And so we have children, you know, who are graduating, from college. I mean, not college, well, sometimes from college, but
Mm,
from high school,
mm,
secondary schools, who who basically some of them can't read or read on the sixth grade level, but have been just propelled
mm,
forward
mm.
because a system can't handle any broad scale of distinction or giving individual attention.
It's interesting, isn't it? And it goes back to those sweeping statements, the full moon is going to bring about, conscious change yeah, for all. And yet our our population across the globe are all at different rates. Everyone is at a different rate of evolvement, emotionally, spiritually, consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how could it really? There is a collective sense, I think, of, as you've, pointed out, that there is a sense of change, and we see it, we feel it, and we reflect back to our parents, perhaps, or another older generation, and look, and they say, "This is what's changed." It's quite different now. But you're right, it doesn't address the individual. Hmm.
Well, it's one of the reasons, and I'm glad you brought this up. It's one of the reasons why I've stopped doing horoscopes, um, and speaking on particular aspects, unless I can speak about them in a very specific way, or I talk about them in relation to myself.
Hmm.
Because I think we astrologers like to believe we are describing things for a collective.
Hmm.
On some level, that is true. On another level, it isn't. Okay, which is it? Well, the reason why I say on some level is true, there may be people who are listening to an astrologer who may strongly relate to what someone is saying. Then there's going to be a number of people who are going to be listening to the same astrologer and be like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Thinking about that blue moon just from yesterday
Hmm.
and going like, yeah, there was no sudden
No.
opening of my consciousness.
Yeah.
I actually felt the opposite. I just wanted to sleep for 24 hours. Um, so I felt like shut down, certainly. So what they're talking about is what they imagine is happening for a segment of the population. The other thing, remember, there's always a skeptic that pops up. Um, the skeptic that pops up, I can listen to, let's say, 5 or 6 different astrologers, and they may be talking about 5 or 6 different things related to what's expected to happen with any particular lunation or aspect. Now, sometimes they may get on the same page, but other times they're talking different nuances. And you may say,
Hmm.
like, well, it's just nuances. Sure. But they also could be talking about wildly divergent things. And what I've come to realize is that they're speaking to their experience, which is fine. But again, it's a projection related to a group. And I think astrology's key gift is having some measure of specificity.
Right.
And it's related to a particular chart and a particular moment. And so you could be descriptive of a particular moment,
Yes.
um, and even with a particular technique. So that could be, you know, looking at the ingress of Aries or Uranus into particular part of the world. Say from my country, it would be
Hmm.
Washington. The capital of New Zealand is Christchurch, or is it Auckland?
No, Wellington.
Wellington. See, I had it all
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, Wellington. Um, so it's
Oh.
Wellington,
Yeah.
and I would be looking at what's happening related to for New Zealand, and what might be happening in New Zealand may be very different than what's happening in Washington D.C. And likely it
Mm.
is.
Likely
So
it
I
is.
think
Yeah. Yeah.
some way we lose our specificity in terms of what we because we want to speak to the world, because we can to some degree through the World Wide Web, I
Mm.
think we lose something. We have to be careful.
Yeah, I hear you. I do hear you. On some levels, I'm quite interested to hear the beautiful, and she's very lovely, Heather Ainsworth and Pam Gregory, and those lovely women talk about these big events or these interesting interstellar alignments or misalignments, and what that might mean um, at a certain time. But does it? Does it?
I mean, does it?
Yeah,
Right. That's a good
yeah.
question. I mean,
But does
I
it?
think sometimes, and sometimes, to be fair, they're so, sometimes the description is too, so broad. How do you measure it? If someone says, like, there's been a shift in human consciousness, where, and maybe there has been, um, but how do we localize it? And do we? And how do we know? Um,
So is your advice to sort of stick with the knitting in a sense and really address our individual relationship with the cosmos through our astrological chart?
well, I always go back to specificity. So, for instance, you can talk about what we can expect related to, if we're looking at a specific chart, for Washington, D.C., what might be happening for the United States.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the way astrology functioned, that we would talk about what would be happening for a particular region or a particular kingdom at a
Yeah.
particular time.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that has a lot of balance. So, for instance, you could look at a particular chart and have some sense of what might be happening for a country related to its elections, its rulers, all these other things at a particular time. But that does not necessarily become universal. And I think our impulse is to go more toward the universal, um, rather than also thinking about the specificity either for an individual, for a region, or
Wow.
one's relationship to it. You know,
Interesting, a region. I've never thought about it like that, that a region has a chart, has its own chart. Yeah,
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 countries do have their own charts.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think we have to take some measure of that into
Mm,
effect. And I don't think we always do. Um, that's kind of, and it gets even more complicated. So, for instance, for the last 11 months, tropical astrologers have been talking about Jupiter being in Cancer.
mhm.
Now, sidereal astrologers, as of today, June 1st, are talking about Jupiter going into Cancer now. So it's the same planet, but because we're using differing zodiacs that are 23 degrees different, we have a different measure. Now, you might say, well, who's right? That becomes harder to tell. It just
Yeah.
it depends on who you're attuned to. Like for someone who's
Mhm.
attuned to more the Vedic sidereal zodiac, and they're not the same. I'm just saying, um, in that kind of way of learning, then you're going to be talking about Jupiter in Cancer. But I mean, as a tropical astrologer myself, I've been talking about Jupiter in Cancer for the last 11 months.
Yeah.
So it's going to be, again, there's a specificity and a way of personal encounter that is in astrology that's a lot more complicated than we generally acknowledge.
Yeah. So for someone listening who is curious but skeptical, where would you invite them to begin?
Hmm. Um, well, I'm a big fan of books. So I would say the textbook that I use if you want to learn astrology.
Mm,
And when I say learn astrology, learn it from a more traditional point of view that opens up a gateway into going more toward the modern. I would say On the Heavenly Spheres, that's the name of the book, by Helena Avelar and Luis Ribeiro, who are Portuguese. They were a Portuguese couple. I say they were because Luis is still with us, but Helena is not. She passed away
Mhm.
in 2021. Um, if and I'm not a I think this is an interesting book. This is for the hardcore skeptic. Um, A Scheme of Heaven by Alexander Boxer might be a good way to kind of venture in because it's written by a data scientist who does a critical evaluation of astrology, um, with, I think, some attendant study of its history and its importance. And he's not completely dismissive. He doesn't embrace astrology, but I found it um, a fair treatment, skeptical treatment of astrology to a
Interesting.
point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's his book. If people are more visual and auditory, I would say start with Chris Brennan's astrology podcast because Chris covers a wide swath of topics related to astrology. Um, that gives more of a learned perspective on it. What I would dissuade folks from embracing is just looking at, some of the studies that have been done to disprove astrology. And not
Right.
because, like, you know, stay away from those because but many of them are skewed.
Sure. Yeah.
Or, you know, when I say skewed, they actually haven't studied the subject. So some things they will operate from the wrong premise. Um, and so that's kind of one particular thing I would say. Um, but yeah, read astrology books with a critical eye. It's like, well, does this relate to me?
Mm.
Why not?
Mm.
Um, what might I learn? Because going back to where I started, and I said I got away from it, but it's not a bad place to start. It is a interesting heuristic hermeneutic, a way in which you can come to ask questions and interrogate some dimensions of yourself that get you to ponder a larger sense of self. But the more you study astrology, in my opinion, the more it becomes less about yourself, which is what I've discovered.
Interesting. Interesting. Thank you so much,
You're
Samuel. I've
welcome.
really enjoyed this. I am going to go away and explore the books, but I probably wouldn't go the deep skeptic way because I'm not there.
You're not
I'm
there.
not,
No, I
I'm
get
not
that.
there. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But thank you. I think I really, I don't want to say understand. I really feel the curiosity peaked within me now to dive in a little deeper, and maybe hopefully that's what other people do too. Yeah. So thank you,
I
my
hope so
dear.
too.
I
Thank you.
really enjoyed that. I so enjoyed it. And I put everything, all of my notes in
Okay.
the,
Reach me at
yeah,
unlockastrology.com.
yeah.
And then if they want to write me, it's unlockastrology, all one word, at gmail.com.
Fantastic. Okay. I think they
Thank
probably
you.
will. Yeah, it'd be wonderful. And yeah, let's stay in touch.
Yes, let's do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, my love.